When I was 16, I didn't expect anyone to come looking for me. Not in that jungle outpost. Not after years of drifting between temporary camps and crews that only needed extra hands for clearing brush or hauling timber downriver. I had no family name worth speaking, no trade certificate, no letter of introduction. I was the boy they called when someone needed a back and didn't want to pay for a man's. The outpost sat on a mud flat where the Cora River bent west, a cluster of tin-roofed shacks and palm-thatch lean-tos held together by rope, rust, and stubbornness. 18 men lived there in the dry months, fewer in the wet. They cut hardwood for a mill operator downriver who paid by the log and never visited. The air smelled of wet bark, diesel smoke, and the sulfur tang of river mud baking under a midday sun that hit 104 degrees by noon. I slept under a tarp strung between two ironwood posts. That was my share. But one afternoon in March of 1923, a man in a clean shirt arrived with a leather folder and my name written on it. He came upriver on a supply boat that usually carried nothing but kerosene, flour, and ammunition. He was thin, pale at the temples, and sweating through his collar before he'd taken 3 steps off the dock. A lawyer from Maracaibo, he said. He asked for me by full name, a name I hadn't heard anyone use in 4 years. He said my grandmother had left something behind. The men at the camp were sitting on upturned crates, sharpening machetes, and watching the stranger the way dogs watch a cat that has wandered too close. She didn't own anything, one of them said, a big man named Cortez who ran the cutting crew. Just a cave somewhere up in the gorge. The lawyer didn't argue. He stood in the shade of the supply shed and opened his leather folder and showed me a document with seals and signatures and language I could barely follow. Then he handed me a folded map and a small iron key, even though he admitted there wasn't technically a door. Your grandmother filed a claim on the parcel in 1914, he said. It passed through probate. It's yours. He left on the same boat that afternoon. He didn't stay for supper. That night, the men joked about it around the fire. A hole in the mountain, Cortez said, shaking his head. Congratulations, boy. You've inherited a bat roost. Someone else said maybe I could charge rent to the spiders. They all laughed. I sat on my crate and said nothing. I was good at that, saying nothing. It was the one skill nobody mocked because nobody noticed it. I almost didn't go, but I had nowhere else to stand. That was the truth of it. The tarp between the ironwood posts belonged to the camp, not to me. Everything I used belonged to someone else. Even my machete was borrowed. The cave, whatever it was, would be the first thing in my life with my name attached to it. I left before dawn. The map led me upriver for 6 miles, then off the main channel into a gorge where the water narrowed between walls of black limestone streaked with orange lichen. The canopy closed overhead so tight that the light turned green and dim, like being inside a bottle. Howler monkeys screamed from somewhere above, and a pair of toucans broke from the upper branches with a sound like tearing cloth. The cave was hidden behind a bend in the river, half concealed by hanging vines and exposed roots gripping the cliff face like the fingers of something old trying to hold on. From the outside, it looked like nothing, just a shadow in stone, an accident of erosion that the jungle was slowly swallowing. Inside, it was worse. Cold, damp, narrow. The entrance passage was barely 4 feet wide and maybe 15 feet deep, with a ceiling that dripped steadily onto a floor of wet gravel and bat guano. The smell was sharp, ammonia and mineral damp and the sour sweetness of rotting leaf matter that the river had pushed inside during past floods. I could see where the water line had reached. A dark stain about 3 feet up the walls, crusted with dried algae. If this was my inheritance, it didn't look like much. I stood there with the iron key in my pocket and the map in my hand and thought about turning around. I thought about Cortez and his laughter. I thought about the tarp between the ironwood posts and how even that small shelter belonged to someone else's goodwill. Then I moved deeper, and I noticed something. The rock ceiling was thick limestone, stable, solid, without the crumbling fracture lines I'd seen in weaker sandstone overhangs along the river. I pressed my palm flat against it, cool, dry where the drip lines didn't reach. I looked down. The floor sloped, not randomly, but with a gentle, steady grade that angled toward a narrow crack at the base of the left wall. Water followed that crack and vanished. Natural drainage. I followed the passage another 20 feet, ducking under a low shelf of rock, and found that the entrance tunnel opened into a second space, a chamber perhaps 12 feet across and 8 feet high, roughly oval, with a floor of packed earth rather than gravel. Dry. Not lucky dry. Not dry, because the rain hadn't come yet. Dry the way stone is dry when it sits above the water table and the air moves through it just enough to carry moisture away. I could feel a faint current against my face, cool air drawn from somewhere deeper in the rock, rising through fissures I couldn't see, pulling dampness with it. Designed dry, engineered by geology over thousands of years, and my grandmother, a woman I barely remembered, who had died when I was 11, had recognized it. She hadn't left me a cave, she'd left me a start. I stayed. The first night was the hardest. Not because of the cold, though it was cold, the kind of damp chill that settles into your joints and stays. Not because of the sounds, though they were constant. The drip of water, of echoing off limestone, the faint shuffle of bats resettling on the ceiling of the outer passage, the distant rumble of the river through rock. The hardest part was the silence between those sounds, a silence so complete it felt physical, like a hand pressed against my ears. I had never slept truly alone before. Even in the worst camps, there were other bodies nearby, breathing, coughing, shifting. In the cave, there was only me and the mountain. I lay on bare stone that first night, wrapped in the single blanket I'd carried from the outpost, and I stared into the kind of darkness that doesn't thin no matter how long you wait. I thought about leaving. I thought about the fire at the outpost, the sound of men talking, the safety of being near others even when those others didn't care about you. Then I thought about my grandmother, about a woman who had chosen this place, not stumbled into it, but filed a legal claim on it, paid whatever fees were required, and kept it. She had seen something in this darkness that was worth owning. I decided to stay long enough to see it too. Those first weeks tested everything I thought I knew about work. I cleared the collapsed stones from the entrance passage one by one, stacking them outside in a pattern that looked natural, like a rock slide, not a wall. I cut timber from a stand of laurel trees half a mile downstream, dragging each log by hand because I had no mule. I trimmed the logs with a borrowed axe and fitted them as braces against the inner chamber's ceiling, where I spotted hairline cracks. Not dangerous yet, but worth reinforcing before the wet season brought its weight of water and shifting soil. I learned to read the cave the way a sailor reads a hull. Every surface told me something. Mineral stains showed where water had traveled in past decades. Scratch marks on the lower walls, fine, parallel, ancient, told me the river had reached this chamber maybe once a century, during floods so large they had no living witnesses. The faint current of air I'd felt on my first visit became my most important tool. I carved ventilation channels along natural fractures in the rock, angling them upward so that warm, humid air from the entrance would rise and exit through the ceiling fissures, pulling fresh air in behind it. The principle was simple. Hot air rises, cool air follows. But getting the angles right took weeks of trial. I tested airflow with smoke from smoldering green wood, watching which way it curled, adjusting the channels with a hand chisel until the circulation moved steadily without drafts, strong enough to scatter a fire. The mountain breathed. I was learning its rhythms. I built a raised sleeping platform in the inner chamber, a frame of laurel poles lashed with palm fiber cordage, set 18 inches above the packed earth floor. The elevation kept me above the residual dampness and away from the scorpions and centipedes that traveled the ground at night. I wove a sleeping mat from split palm fronds and covered it with dried grass that I changed every 2 weeks to prevent mold. Outside, I dug drainage trenches along the slope above the entrance, shallow channels that followed the natural erosion lines so closely that anyone passing would see only weathered grooves in the hillside. The trenches diverted rainwater around the cave mouth and into the river below. I reinforced them with flat stones set at angles, like fish scales, so the water would sheet across rather than cut deeper into the soil. Every detail had to disappear into the environment. If someone passed by, they would see nothing. That was the point. Not because I feared thieves, I owned nothing worth stealing, but because the jungle punished anything that stood out. Structures that fought the landscape attracted attention, from weather, from insects, from rot, from men. Structures that hid within it survived. My grandmother had understood that. She had lived in this gorge for years before she died, and no one at the outpost had known exactly where. They knew about the cave the way people know about a rumor, vaguely, without detail, without respect. I intended to keep it that way. The jungle didn't make it easy. It never does. The first lesson was food. Everything I thought I knew about storing provisions meant nothing in 90% humidity. Smoked fish turned soft and gray within 3 days. Dried cassava flour clumped into a damp paste that smelled like mildew. Fruit attracted clouds of tiny flies that seemed to materialize from the air itself, and any scrap of meat left exposed overnight would be covered in a fur of white mold by dawn. I watched. I experimented. I failed often. Food spoiled in the humidity if I didn't manage storage carefully. I built a cache box from split hardwood planks, sealed with tree resin, and suspended it from the chamber ceiling on cordage treated with crushed tobacco leaf to repel ants. Even so, I lost a week's worth of dried fish to a column of army ants that found a path I hadn't anticipated. I rebuilt the cache with a wider resin seal and added a moat ring, a shallow trough carved into the ceiling beam, filled with water, that stopped them cold. One of my support beams cracked under the weight of wet limestone dust that had settled on it during the first heavy rains. The sound woke me at 2 a.m, a slow, groaning pop that echoed through the chamber like a warning. I spent the next 3 days replacing it with a thicker log, cutting a notch joint at the top so the beam sat flush against the ceiling rather than pressing against a single point. I learned that the jungle rewarded patience and punished shortcuts. Every repair taught me something. Every failure left a mark. On the stone, on my hands, on my memory. I kept a small leather-bound journal that the lawyer had left with the map, and I filled it with measurements, sketches, and notes about what worked and what didn't. A week of heavy rain in May nearly flooded the entrance before my drainage system caught up. Water pooled 3 inches deep in the passage, and for 2 hours I worked in the dark with a wooden scoop, bailing and cursing and promising myself I'd dig the outer trenches 6 inches deeper. I did, and the next rain passed without a whisper. By the end of the first wet season, the cave was dry, ventilated, and stable. I had clean water from a limestone seep I'd tapped with a bamboo pipe, feeding into a clay pot I'd traded for at a river post 10 miles downstream. I had a fire pit near the entrance with a smoke channel that drew fumes upward through a natural chimney crack I'd widened with careful chiseling. The inner chamber stayed between 70 and 76 degrees, even when the jungle outside swung from 58 at dawn to 106 at midday. I was surviving, but more than that, I was building. Surviving was building. The two were the same thing. The dry months between June and September became my construction season. I cut bamboo from a stand near the riverbank and split it into planks for shelving. I fashioned hooks from bent iron nails salvaged from the outpost's rubbish pile, hammering them into crevices to hang tools and clothing where the air could reach them. I gathered clay from a deposit upstream and mixed it with sand and chopped grass fibers to make a rough plaster that I troweled over the inner walls, not for beauty, but to seal hairline cracks that let moisture weep through during the heaviest rains. Each improvement was small. Each one mattered. I began to take pride in the routines. Morning inspection of the drainage trenches, weekly replacement of the sleeping mat grass, monthly sharpening of the axe and machete. I'd acquired my own by then, traded for with surplus smoked fish. I kept the blades oiled with palm fat to prevent rust in the humid air, and I stored them in a wooden rack I'd built against the driest wall of the inner chamber, each tool in its place, each place chosen for a reason. The journal filled. I wrote in small, careful letters to make the pages last. I recorded temperatures, estimated since I had no thermometer, and rainfall observations, and the dates when certain birds appeared or disappeared, and the height of the river against a mark I'd chiseled into the cliff face near the entrance. I didn't know why I recorded these things, except that recording them made me feel less alone. The jungle was talking, in its way. I was learning to write down what it said. By autumn, a girl my age appeared at the river post. Her name was Lucia. She was the daughter of a Portuguese trader who had died of fever 6 months earlier, leaving her with a canoe, a box of unsold goods, and no family within 500 miles. The postkeeper let her sleep in the storage shed in exchange for mending clothes and keeping his accounts, which she did better than he did. She could read, write, and calculate sums in her head faster than most men could with a pencil. We met because I came to trade smoked fish for salt, and she was the one behind the counter. "You're the cave boy," she said, not a question. "I live in the gorge," I said. "They say you talk to bats." "I don't talk to bats. They say a lot of things." She weighed my fish on a hand scale and pushed a cloth bag of salt across the counter. Mostly wrong. She was practical, sharp-eyed, and unimpressed by the bluster of the men who came through the post. She had her own kind of quiet, not the silence of someone afraid to speak, but the economy of someone who had learned that most words were wasted. Over the following months, she came to the gorge twice. The first time, she stood at the entrance and studied the drainage trenches without speaking. The second time, she came inside and sat in the inner chamber for an hour, running her hand along the ventilation channels I'd carved. "Your grandmother taught you this?" she asked. "She didn't teach me anything. She died before I was old enough to learn." "Then how did you know what to do?" I looked at what she'd started, and I kept looking until I understood. Lucia nodded. She didn't say it was impressive or clever. She said, "The smoke channel needs a wider throat. You're losing draft. She was right. She began helping me with the structural work, not out of charity, but because she understood materials. Her father had built boats, and she knew wood the way I was learning to know stone. Together, we reinforced the entrance passage with a framework of interlocking hardwood beams that distributed weight across a wider span. She showed me a lashing technique her father had used on hull ribs, a spiral wrap with alternating tension that held firmer than any square knot I'd tried. For the first time, the work didn't feel solitary. Then the fire came. I smelled it before I saw it. It was late, October, deep in the dry season, and the jungle floor was layered with months of fallen leaves as brittle as paper. The sky turned copper one afternoon, a sick, heavy color that pressed down on the canopy like a lid. The wind shifted wrong, blowing uphill from the southeast instead of following the river. Birds went silent. Howlers stopped calling. I climbed to the ridge above the gorge and looked east. A wall of smoke, gray-brown and rolling, filled the valley from ridgeline to ridgeline. Below it, a bright orange seam, the fire line, moved through the upper forest canopy with a speed that made my stomach drop. Trees didn't burn the way people imagine, one at a time, politely. They exploded, sap boiled. Crowns ignited in bursts of orange and white. The sound carried across 2 miles of open air, a continuous low roar, like a river made of heat. I ran back to the gorge. At the outpost, 6 miles downstream, the men were already scrambling. I learned later that the fire had reached the camp within 40 minutes of the first sighting. Surface shelters, palm thatch, canvas tarps, the tin-roofed shacks with their dry timber frames, burned in less than 5 minutes each. Cortez tried to organize a retreat toward the river, but fallen trees, ignited and crashing across the path, blocked the route. 3 men were burned. 1 nearly died. I didn't know any of that yet. What I knew was the smell. Sharp, acrid, with an undertone of scorched resin that stung the inside of my nose. And the wall of heat advancing through the gorge like something alive and deliberate. I sealed the outer entrance gap with wet soil. River mud I'd stockpiled in clay pots for exactly this kind of emergency, though I'd never tested it against anything real. I packed the mud into every crack and seam in the entrance passage, working fast, my hands shaking not from fear, but from the knowledge that if I'd misjudged anything, the ventilation angles, the depth of the inner chamber, the integrity of the stone, I would not get a second chance. I retreated into the inner chamber and pulled a wet canvas sheet across the passage opening behind me. Then I sat in darkness. Heat pressed against the stone like a living thing. Not flame, but radiant energy moving through solid rock the way a fever moves through a body. The walls were warm to the touch. The air tasted of minerals and faint smoke. I could hear the fire above me, muffled, enormous, a sound that vibrated in my chest rather than my ears. If even one ventilation shaft was angled wrong, if smoke found its way down instead of up, I wouldn't wake from this. I counted my breaths, slow, steady, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the same rhythm I used when I was chiseling stone or testing lashings under load. The body wanted to panic. I didn't let it. The mountain trembled with heat, but the stone held. I sat in that darkness for 9 hours. Sometime around midnight, the temperature in the chamber peaked. I guessed 86, maybe 88 degrees. And then, slowly, it began to fall. The roar above faded into a crackling whisper. The air cleared. By morning, I pushed through the mud seal and stepped outside. The valley was black. Every tree within sight was stripped to charcoal. The canopy was gone, replaced by a gray sky I hadn't seen unfiltered in months. Ash drifted down like snow. The river ran dark with soot. The ground was hot underfoot, and in places, roots still smoldered beneath the surface. The wooden shelters at the outpost were gone. Supplies reduced to ash. The men I'd left behind had survived by wading into the river and staying submerged for hours, breathing through bamboo tubes someone had thought to grab. They'd lost everything above the waterline. The only place untouched was the cave. I stood at the entrance and looked at what remained. The outer vines were burned away. The hanging roots were gone. The cliff face was scorched black, but the cave mouth was intact. The mud seal had held. The drainage trenches, though filled with ash, still held their shape. Inside, the inner chamber was cool, dry, and untouched. The sleeping platform, the cache box, the fire pit, the clay water pot, all exactly as I'd left them. Cortez was the first to arrive. He came up the gorge alone, walking slowly, his arms wrapped in wet cloth where the fire had caught him. He stood outside the entrance and stared at the stone, the way a man stares at something he doesn't want to believe. "It held," he said. "It held," I said. He didn't laugh. Over the next week, 11 men came to the gorge. They slept in the entrance passage and along the outer ledge while I shared water from the limestone seep and dried food from the cache. They watched me rebuild the mud seal and repair the drainage trenches, and they said very little. Some of them helped. One man, a quiet cutter named Delgado, who had never spoken to me before, asked me to show him how I'd angled the ventilation channels. I showed him. He listened the way I listened when the jungle was teaching me something, without interrupting, without pretending he already knew. For 3 weeks, the cave served as a shelter for everyone who had lost their place in the fire. They ate my food, drank my water, and slept under my stone ceiling. I didn't ask for anything in return. I didn't need to. The cave was doing what it had always been designed to do, providing safety for those who respected the mountain enough to step inside. When the rains returned and the forest began its slow recovery, green shoots pushing through black ash, ferns uncurling from scorched root balls, the first tentative birdsong returning to the canopy, the men went back to rebuild the outpost. But something had changed, not in the jungle, which recovered with the same patient indifference it had always shown toward human affairs. In them, they had said, "My grandmother left me nothing." She left me something stronger than a house. She left me a fortress hidden in plain sight, built not from timber or thatch or tin, but from stone that understood fire, from airflow that carried poison upward and away, from drainage that kept water where water belonged. She left me the mountain itself. And this time, no one laughed. That was 63 years ago. I am 79 now. The gorge has changed, but the cave has not. I widened the entrance passage in 1931, added a second chamber for storage in 1938, following a seam of softer calcium carbonate that my chisel found behind the north wall. In 1945, a geologist from the University of Caracas visited and spent 3 days mapping the interior. He told me the ventilation system I'd carved followed the same thermodynamic principles used in Roman hypocausts, the stack effect, he called it, and that the limestone acted as a natural humidity buffer, absorbing moisture when the air was wet and releasing it when the air was dry. He measured the inner chamber with instruments I'd never seen before, a mercury thermometer, a sling psychrometer for humidity, a device that tested airflow velocity with a spinning vane. The numbers confirmed what my body had known for 20 years. The chamber maintained a temperature range of 70 to 76 degrees Fahrenheit and a relative humidity between 45 and 55% year-round, regardless of conditions outside. He said those numbers would make a museum curator weep with envy. "Your grandmother must have been a remarkable woman," he said. "She was," I said, "though I don't remember her face. I remember her hands, or I think I do. Broad, brown, with short nails and a scar on the left thumb. Maybe I invented that memory. Maybe the cave gave it to me." Lucia and I were married in 1929 at the river post where we met. She moved into the cave, then helped me expand it into something closer to a home. A cookhouse built against the cliff face using the same interlocking beam technique she'd learned from her father's boatyard. A covered walkway with a thatch roof pitched at 45 degrees to shed rain cleanly, and a garden terrace cut into the slope above the entrance where we grew peppers, cassava, and a small grove of cacao trees that still bear fruit. We raised 3 children in the gorge. The eldest, Tomas, became a surveyor. He maps roads now, far from here. Our daughter, Beatrice, teaches school in a town I've never visited. The youngest, Miguel, stayed. He tends the garden and keeps the drainage trenches clear and knows the cave's breathing patterns as well as I do. Maybe better. I have taught him everything I know, not by lecturing, by showing, by handing him the chisel and stepping back, by letting him make his own mistakes with the lashings and the ventilation angles and the smoke channels, and then asking him what he noticed. He noticed a lot. The journal the lawyer gave me in 1923 is full now. Both sides of every page, the margins covered in sketches and corrections and small observations about temperature, rainfall, river levels, and the behavior of the colony of bats that still roost in a side passage I've never disturbed. A second journal sits beside it, and a third. 60 years of looking and writing. Some evenings I sit at the entrance and watch the mist rise off the river as the sun drops behind the western ridge. The canopy has grown back. It always does. The gorge is green again, dense and singing with insects and birds that don't know what happened here 60 years ago. The fire is a memory. The men who laughed are memories. Cortez died in 1951 peacefully in a hammock at the rebuilt outpost. We had become something like friends by then. I think about my grandmother often. I think about what it means to leave someone a place rather than a thing. A thing can be used up. A place asks you to pay attention. It asks you to learn what it already knows, where the water goes, how the air moves, what the stone remembers. She could have left me money, if she'd had any. She could have left me a tool, a weapon, a letter of instruction. Instead, she left me a question, a shadow in rock that required years of looking before it became an answer. And in the looking, I became someone capable of understanding the answer. That was the real inheritance, not the cave, the capacity for attention that the cave demanded. I think about the men who laughed. I don't blame them. Laughter is how people handle things they don't understand. Cortez laughed because he had spent 30 years cutting timber and building shelters that the jungle ate in 5. The idea that a hole in the ground could outlast all of it, could outlast him, was too large to fit inside his experience. So he laughed. And then the fire came, and the hole in the ground was the only thing left standing, and the laughter stopped. And something quieter took its place. She gave me a shadow in the rock, and I spent my life listening to what it had to say. The jungle punished hurry, but it rewarded attention. That was the truest thing I ever learned. Miguel will carry it forward, and maybe his children after him. Not the cave, The cave belongs to the mountain, but the habit of looking, the patience to measure twice, the knowledge that the world will teach you everything you need if you are quiet enough to hear it. The air in the inner chamber is 72 degrees tonight. Cool, dry, steady. The mountain still breathes, and so, for now, do I.